Hi, my name is MeeDm and Andrea and I are going to do a presentation on gender, religion, and modernization in Saudi Arabia for the class Arabic for Global Exchange Online. So now we're going to talk about some gender-related issues in Saudi Arabia. Specifically, abortion is the first part that I want to talk about. So it is allowed, but it is only allowed in certain circumstances. So some of these are when the pregnant woman's physical or mental health are in danger, fetal impairment, or rape. But it does require the approval of the father or guardian in these cases. And in general, this is actually pretty lax compared to other Arab countries, and it's actually more lax than Alabama state laws, if you can believe that. So when compared to the states, it's also can be considered not the worst, which is interesting as well. So for some LGBTQ plus laws related to LGBTQ plus anyway, homosexuality is punishable by death. They are, first of all, usually first-time offenders are incarcerated and flogged around 3 years and usually the second time they are executed. As you can see, same-sex marriage is not legal, and it is illegal to change legal gender, and there's no protections against LGBTQ plus discrimination. So for example, if an employer says, hey, we're not going to hire you because you are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer, the government will not do anything to stop that. Like, they are legally allowed to discriminate against these people for no other reason other than being who they are, right? This also pertains to housing as well. Additionally, sexual relations outside of marriage is considered illegal, and that also you can be incarcerated, etc. And so homosexual sexual relations, which has to be outside of marriage because marriage is not legal for same-sex marriages, usually end up in being charged with both sexual relations outside of marriage as well as homosexuality, and so it ends up being like a higher sentence for the homosexual partners. However, in reality, it can be a little bit different. So I read an article who talked to certain citizens of Saudi Arabia who admitted to having relations with people of the same sex. Yeah, and it does happen here. And they even said that it's easier to be homosexual than to be heterosexual because everybody, basically, heterosexual or homosexual, has to go through some sort of oppression, or not oppression, but laws. So for instance, if a woman and a man is walking across the street, they can legally be questioned as their intentions, whether they're married, whether they're having relations by the police who find them walking across the street. So yeah, even heterosexual couples will have to go through some problems with the police sometimes, etc. So talking to these citizens, the article talks about how they suggest that having sex with other men as a man is not gay unless you are the bottom. And they can still keep their masculinity as long as they fulfill this requirement. Even if they are having gay sex, as you might say, they don't consider themselves gay. Also, another lady said she had lesbian relations inside of a high school bathroom, and that this happens quite more often than you would think inside of same-sex schools, high schools. Yeah. And the strict segregation of the sexes, they say, sometimes leads to more homosexual sex in Saudi Arabia. And they say some cafes are known to be a place where men meet other men, since some cafes are limited to only men, so it can lead to homosexual sex from meeting people from there, etc. Just, it is more apparent in society than you would think when you only look at the laws. So there's some differences and similarities between Saudi Arabia and the United States in the realm of LGBTQ+. So in Saudi Arabia, as we said, it's illegal to be part of the same-sex relationship or marriage. It's illegal to change your gender, and there's no protection against discrimination of LGBTQ+ members. So actually, in the United States, it's not all that different. It is different, not too much. In 2015, the Supreme Court did rule for same-sex marriages across all 50 states, so it is legal now to marry people of the same sex. However, most states do allow gender change on legal documents with certain requirements, but Tennessee, Idaho, and Kansas, similarly to Saudi Arabia, do not allow changes to your birth certificate, regardless of like whether you've had a transgender like surgery or whether you are taking medication or whether you have a doctor's note, whether you have a court order. Nothing matters. You're not allowed to have any changes to the birth certificate. And also going back to like that most states do allow gender change. A lot of the times like it's not like actual gender change on your birth certificate. It may just be a note in the margin saying this person has legally changed their gender, but they still keep their original gender at birth, um, or sex, I should say. Um, and sometimes it has to be from a court order where they have to have some sort of transition surgery, etc. So it's not so like easy to change your gender as you would think. It just can't be like in some states you can't just show up with a doctor's note saying, "Hey, this person has changed their gender." Um, Also, there is no federal law in the states to protect against discrimination of LGBTQ plus members, similarly to Saudi Arabia, but 22 states have enacted state laws to protect against this. However, that's 28 states that haven't done that. So if you think about that, it is pretty similar to Saudi Arabia in this case, to protect against discrimination.
Hello, my name's Andrea, and I focused on researching women's right and status in Saudi Arabia, as well as the role of religion in the country. So, since 2017, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has made surprising reforms pertaining to women's rights, such as women are now allowed to register a birth certificate, marriage, or divorce. Um, this overturned legislation which made it impossible for women to make decisions without male guardian approval. Dress code there in the country is interpreted by Islamic law. It is enforced by varying degrees around the country. Majority of the women wear an abaya and a headscarf. Their face does not necessarily need to be covered. However, religious police will still harass women for exposing too much flesh or makeup. And as seen below in the images are how the women in Saudi Arabia typically dress because it is government mandated. There is segregation by sex in Saudi Arabia. Women have to limit the amount of time spent with males not related to them. Majority of the public buildings have separate entrances for the different sexes in order to um, make sure they are segregated from one another. Public transportation, parks, benches, and amusement parks are also segregated. However, in 2019, the government announced that restaurants are no longer required to have separate entrances for the two sexes. Unlawful mixing can bring criminal charges, with women receiving the harsher punishment. As a step towards, one would say, increasing women's rights in Saudi Arabia, 2 women were sent to represent the country in the 2012 Olympics. However, they faced massive criticism from the conservative citizens in Saudi Arabia, and they had to go to London with a male guardian and cover their hair. As mentioned before, the current crown prince is expanding women's rights. And in 2017, Saudi Arabia's national stadium welcomed its first ever female spectators. And he recently also granted women the right to drive. Comparing the status of women in Saudi Arabia and the United States, similarities between the two: women are allowed to vote in elections. However, elections are rarely held in Saudi Arabia, and I read that even when they are held, they do very little to bring about any political or social reform. They are allowed to hold elected positions it was very hard for me to find any data really about the number of women that actually do hold legislative positions. They can seek employment, however, they need male relative approval. And as mentioned earlier in the abortion rights section of our presentation, Saudi women can receive an abortion, but they need husband approval. To talk more about the gender inequality that goes about in Saudi Arabia, gender equality is actually codified in Saudi law, and women are legal minors and dependent upon men. This is written in the Constitution of Saudi Arabia. There is a system of male guardianship. As I mentioned, women have to rely on male relatives to make any big decisions or go about in public. There's a mandated dress code, and there is sexual segregation in all public places pretty much in the country. And then for in the United States, there is income inequality that still needs to be bridged between the two sexes.
So now we're going to switch gears into modernization and religion in Saudi Arabia. So now I'm going to talk about what is modernization and how is it connected to Saudi Arabia. So first of all, modernization, it's a little broad of a topic, but in sociology, it's the transformation from a traditional rural agrarian society to secular urban industrial society. So modernization in Saudi Arabia, during the last 50 years, the leader has done really, really well in improving a lot of these statistics, including literacy, infant mortality, and race average life expectancy. So literacy went from 5% to 99%, which is a big percentage, and infant mortality went from 30% to 1%. They're slowly improving human rights. Western concerts are allowed. Women are given the freedom to drive and attend sports events, and vowing to reclaim Islam by firing 3,000 hate-inciting imams and disbanding the religious police, which is a big step in modernizing Saudi Arabia. So I have some reasons why Saudi Arabia is modernizing. So in general, a big percentage of the population is below 30 and wants change. They want to diversify its economy, not only be oil reliant. So right now, Saudi Arabia, or like in the past, Saudi Arabia was very, very reliant on the oil income, and like that's how their economy was thriving. But they want to go away from this and actually like build this economy on like other things. So, for instance, like energy, like other types of energy, etc. And in general, they want more Western allies because of the threat of Iran. So this is the Shia and Sunni conflict that's currently going on. They have a currently tension-bound political bind between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so they want more Western allies. And in order to do this, they want to modernize and show that, they are more similar to the West and get more help from them. So I looked at some key differences and similarities between Saudi Arabia and the United States in modernization. So Saudi Arabia, as I said before, they used to lean on oil for income. So it may be less overall industrialized. In this case, I'm talking about like factories and like other types of income and like building the economy, etc., etc. Building cities, buildings, etc. It's improving in terms of overall modernization of the country, which might be a little bit different than the United States, because I feel like right now in the United States, we're not really like trying to improve the modernization as much. Like we feel like we're all comfortable with where we're at in general. And in general, they still have fairly traditional views on women's rights, not also including like LGBTQ, other rights as well. So some similarities between Saudi Arabia and the United States, as you may be kind of shocked to see. Some states with less cities of a more rural background are similar to Saudi Arabia in terms of modernization. So for example, like states such as like in the South, Tennessee, Kansas, Idaho, as we were talking about before, like those three states, have similar protocols when it came to like transgender rights, and also, yeah, so in that case, like human rights, it is pretty similar, if not less. So Alabama, when it came to abortion, um, also some big groups of people in the states are a little bit similar to Saudi Arabia. For instance, Amish people, Mormons, etc. Some other like cults, maybe some other groups of people, maybe less modernized in general, but yeah. So some specifics about the United States. Some states have more traditional views, as I said before, but a lot of like other states, like California, New York, like as we know, like these states are like much more modernized and different than Saudi Arabia. Like we have like a booming economy from like different things, not just like oil. We have like big factories. We have big buildings. We have just like an okay economy, and yeah, so we are very modernized in that way.
As I talked about gender income inequality in the last slide, I thought this data here was very interesting to find, where 60% of the sample population in Saudi Arabia believe that women should be paid the same as men, so receive the same wages in 2020, which I thought was interesting because they have such stringent segregation between the sexes, but they still overwhelmingly, the population believes that women deserve to be paid the same wages as men. And now, moving on to religion in Saudi Arabia, there are 30 million inhabitants, and 93% of them are Muslim. The country is officially a Muslim nation. Most Saudi Muslims are Sunni. There is a small Shia minority population, and Saudi Arabia is known as the birthplace of Islam. And this graph below shows how um, predominantly they are Muslim inhabitants and Sunni Muslim majority. Saudi Arabia is home to two of Islam's holiest cities, Mecca, where Prophet Muhammad was born. Muhammad is the founder of Islam, and Medina, where Prophet Muhammad was buried. In Mecca, only Muslims are allowed to enter, while in Medina, Muslims and non Muslims are allowed. Tourism in Saudi Arabia largely involves religious pilgrimage because millions of Muslims travel to Mecca during the Hajj to complete the pilgrimage to the Kaaba shrine, which is shown here. And then this is a mosque in Medina. The government in Saudi Arabia follows the ultra conservative Wahhabi interpretation of the Quran. Wahhabism calls for the literal interpretation of the Quran and includes strict enforcement of religious codes and practices. However, the current Saudi prince has taken dramatic steps to change his country's political and economic life. He wants to return to moderate Islam, and as shown, he has granted women the right to drive. He has reintroduced cinemas and has curbed the powers of the religious police. Um, and then, as mentioned here, the Wahhabi doctrine is upheld by clerics who run the judiciary and religious police, but the Crown Prince Mohammed um, is pushing back against that, wanting to install a more of a moderate interpretation of their religion. However, although the crown prince seems to be taking more of a moderate approach towards governing the country, the survey below that I found in our Canvas page shows that around 40% of the sample populations hasn't noticed much of a change at all since the Crown Prince has allowed the reintroduction of movie theaters and other forms of entertainment. So I thought that was interesting. And then comparing religion in Saudi Arabia versus the United States. Um, obviously very different. Here in the United States, we have freedom of religion, where in Saudi Arabia, there is no freedom of religion. All citizens are required by law to be Muslim. The open criticism of Islam can result in imprisonment, flogging, or death. Non Muslims are forbidden from practicing their religion publicly, and there are still religious police patrols, even though the crown prince has, tried to kind of end their powers. So, yeah, thank you for listening to our project, and I hope you guys have gained more insight into the daily life in Saudi Arabia.
And last but not least, this is our bibliography, all the sources we used for this project.